Welcome to an OTT Talks live episode. This is a series of conversations with evidence-informed policy entrepreneurs from all over the world. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and in this particular episode, we will discuss the findings and implications of a recently published study on evidence use in community-led learning ecosystems. This report was produced by OTT with funding from the Jacobs Foundation. And so to discuss the report and its implications, we have three great guests. Marcela Morales, who was formerly at OTT, but is now at the Pousaz Philanthropies. Ross Hall, who was formerly at the Jacobs Foundation and commissioned the report in the first place, and is now at Fondation Botnar. And Yasmine Bekkouche at the Jacobs Foundation. Welcome. And since this is an OTT Talks live, we want to give participants a chance to ask some questions to our guests. This is the first time we do this, so we'll see how it goes. We usually just record these and share them on YouTube and Spotify. And so to make things easier on us this first time, I will ask you to please keep your microphone silenced and ask those questions in the chat box if you can so. And then I will read them out to our guests when we get to the time when we can have an open conversation. So why don't we begin? But first, before we start with the report, I thought it would be great if Ross could help us set the scene by sharing with us what was the motivation behind this study. Ross?
Super. Thanks so much, Enrique, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. The reason or the rationale for commissioning this report started with the central idea that we urgently need to shift learning outcomes for young people. We need to help every young person learn to thrive together, which means that, of course, every young person needs to become literate and numerate, but we can't only focus on those skills. We also need to develop a wide range of other skills. We need to help young people find their power to create a better world, which means developing holistically. And that means we need new ways of looking at the development of young people, i.e., we need new evidence. The second piece of that rationale then is that in order to help young people develop holistically, we need to provide all young people with a much wider set of learning environments and experiences than they're currently getting in schools. We need young people to be learning through projects in nature, in the community, through play, through making, moving, meditating, etc. In other words, again, we need to get beyond the classic model of schooling, sitting behind desks with a textbook. And that, again, requires new ways of looking at the experience of young people, i.e., it needs more new evidence. And the third step, which also requires new types of evidence, is that in order to help young people develop holistically through a new set of learning experiences, we believe we need to shift education systems towards the idea of a learning ecosystem, something that's much more organic and adaptable. Adaptable because each child and each group of children have their own unique learning needs. So the system needs to move from a kind of rather mechanical, standardized system to one which is suited to those unique needs. We need to see much more ownership of the system at the level of the child, at the level of the school and community, in other words. And in order to do that, we need to see much more trust and collaboration throughout the system. So those three things, shifting learning outcomes through learning experiences in learning ecosystems, all requires better informed decision making. In other words, we need to see much better evidence. So we commissioned the report then for two things. First of all, to understand better the evidence for learning ecosystems, and secondly, to understand better the use of evidence in learning ecosystems.
Great, thank you very much, Ross. And with this introduction, I think it's time to turn to the report itself. And we have Marcela Morales, one of the co-authors of the report. So Marcela, why don't you tell us what you and your co-authors, Rachel Makoka and Emma Broadbent, found in this study?
Thank you, Kike, and hello, everyone. Before I dive in, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to my brilliant co-authors, Emma Broadbent and Rachel Makoka, and also huge thanks to Ross and the Yakos Foundation for making this report possible, and also to everyone we interviewed for sharing their insights. I see a few of you here. I see Luke and Emily, so thank you so much for joining us. It's really good to see you. And we learned a lot from this process, and I really enjoyed understanding ecosystems better. And I hope you will enjoy what we've learned as well. So thank you so much, Ross, for setting the stage. What is this review wants to add is a closer look on at how these community-led learning ecosystems are already being built, often by community actors working in partnerships with schools, with civil society, local institutions. And in the next few minutes, I wanted to share three things. So, what we mean by community-led learning ecosystems and why they matter, why we focused on evidence use in these spaces, and finally, some of the lessons that emerged from the study. So we started the report from this moment of crisis, if you like. So we are at the time when education systems are under enormous pressure, from climate change disruption to inequality and violence in schools, conflict everywhere. And we know that while many young people are going to school, they're part of the system. They're often not really learning, or not at least not learning what they need. And we can all agree that foundational skills are essential, but not enough. The world is changing way too fast, and so are the demands on young people. And that's raising tough questions about what quality education really means. And one of the core reasons community-led learning ecosystems matter is because they expand our understanding of what learning is and where it happens. So let me start with the definition. So what are community-led learning ecosystems? I would say from our study and based on what we learned is that they are evolving networks of actors working in and around education. They do center schools, but they extend far beyond them. They involve families, local governments, employers, NGOs, museums, sport clubs, even local businesses. And they are shaped by local priorities, relationships, and lived experience, not just formal institutions or national curricula. And in these ecosystems, learning happens everywhere. In classrooms, yes, but also outside, in public spaces, mentoring groups, neighborhood projects. And this matters because community-led learning ecosystems challenge three fundamental assumptions in traditional education models. What learning is. They broaden the focus beyond academic basics to include social, emotional, and practical skills like collaboration, agency, and identity. Where learning happens, if you like, they break open the school gates and activate community spaces as learning environments. And who is involved in learning? They shift from a model where the school delivers and the communities receive to one where everyone, parents, teachers, local leaders, and the young people themselves become co-creators in this process. So I would say that this goes beyond participation. This is a shift towards true ownership of education. So community-led learning ecosystems is not a niche idea. It's not just a concept. I would say they are a lens, a way to understand and support how learning actually happens, especially in complex environments. So when we started this review, one of the core questions we had was, how is knowledge being generated and used in these ecosystems? What we found is that evidence in community-led learning ecosystems doesn't come from outside. It's often generated, interpreted, and acted upon within the communities to make decisions, to adapt practices, and to build shared understanding. And in that sense, evidence is not seen as a product, but as a process. And I think we all know and we're aware that too often when we talk about education reform, evidence is framed as in linear and technocratic ways. It's produced by researchers, then validated externally, and then handed off to practitioners to implement. But in community-led learning ecosystems, evidence behaves differently. It is collective, is fluid and not fixed, and is deeply embedded in relationships and practice. And in the report, we propose a typology that reflects this complexity. And this typology comes from evidence use, literature, and practice. So we identified 4 overlapping types of evidence use in the ecosystems that we studied. So research-based evidence, that is RCTs, syntheses, academic studies, pedagogical evidence, what's generated by teachers through lesson planning, classroom feedback, and peer exchange. Sector-generated data, that, like, for example, attendance figures, standardized test scores, and also practice-informed evidence, which includes local knowledge, lived experience, contextual reflection. But what's most striking for me is not just that these types of evidence exist, but that the initiatives that we studied blend and repurpose all these types of evidence constantly. And this turns many conventional assumptions on their head. This is assumptions we had. First, who counts as an expert? What counts as valid knowledge? And where does change actually start? That doesn't mean that we discard academic research. I think it's far from it, but it does mean that we must expand our understanding of what evidence looks like and how it's tracked. And I guess ultimately, all of this is about visibility, because when evidence is narrowly defined, a lot of real learning remains invisible, especially the kinds of learning that happened outside of classrooms. So in internships, in youth clubs, in creative projects, in community volunteering, even family caregiving. And that's learning too. That's part of the learning process for children and young people. And the systems we studied show that when we start recognizing these types of evidence that they are generating, we can unlock new possibilities, both for inclusion, but also for innovation. And I wanted to connect these concepts with real life examples, which this is where I think the concept becomes real. And I really encourage you to look at the report, read the examples, and check the work of the amazing organizations we were lucky enough to talk to and understand better. So I just wanted to share just a few of them, just to showcase the breadth. These are not all of the examples, of course, but I wanted to mention, for example, the Brookings Family Engagement Initiative. So they combine research with active engagement. So they are a repository or different tools and research, and their global work on family, school, community engagement spans over 60 countries and focuses strongly on co-creating evidence with families and schools. And what I think is fascinating is that they are also documenting the learning process that goes into working with the parents and working with schools. So there are 2 layers of evidence being generated through this engagement. So I think that's great. Also, the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK and the Research Schools Network, they support peer-to-peer learning amongst educators. So these schools act as brokers of evidence, and they adapt findings to their own realities and support others in doing the same, which is amazing. Also in Spain, a great example is Fundación Bofil and Educación 360. They are a regional movement that frame learning as happening at 360 degrees. So that is in and out of school. And they've worked to expand access to play, arts, and enrichment activities across municipalities. And they are working really hard to position public spaces and civic institutions as key learning actors. Also, Remake Learning in Pittsburgh. This is a very interesting US-based peer network of over 500 organizations that links schools with libraries, museums, and community spaces. I think this is a great example of how connected learning works across a city. And Lively Minds in Ghana and Uganda. They focus on early childhood development by training mothers as volunteer play leaders. And the model blends qualitative and quantitative data to track both child development, but also community engagement. So as you can see from these very few examples, some of these ecosystems form around formal structures like schools or district programs, but others emerge from community action, civil society partnerships, creative coalitions involving cultural institutions, faith groups, even private sector actors. And yeah, and just to wrap up, I think echoing Ross, I think it's really important that we look back at these ecosystems because there's a lot to learn from there. And I think that one of the things that came out in our report is that what's missing isn't just funding to support the growth of this ecosystem, but the right kind of funding. And I would say that supporting community-led learning ecosystems isn't only about scaling up a blueprint. It is really about investing in relationships, capacities, and the reflexive spaces that allow ecosystems to take root and evolve. And I think overall that means shifting the way we think about funding. And across those lines, if there is a key lesson for funders and people in the space, is that it's really important to start funding the interpretation, not just the generation of evidence. I feel like too often evidence is treated as a product to deliver, not a process that we engage with. And what community-led learning ecosystems show us is that making sense of evidence making sense of evidence together is where transformation begins. So it's really important to fund spaces and time and the roles that allow for communities to reflect, to interpret, and actually act on the evidence in a collaborative manner. So I guess ultimately, this means embracing complexity, which is never easy, co-creation, and different forms of knowing. And that means that funders and other stakeholders in the space need to become partners in learning, in the learning process, not just in results. And that calls for a huge shift in the way we think about education and funding evidence generation in these spaces. So I'm gonna finish with that for now. But again, I really hope that you can take a look at the report because there are many examples there and quotes from the people actually doing the work on the ground. And I think that brings all these ideas to life, and we can get a good idea of how things are being implemented. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you, Kike.
No, thank you. Thank you, Marcela. It shows that we've worked together because I had a long list of questions to ask you as follow-up, but you've answered most of them. So I feel sorry. I feel a bit sorry about asking them again, but so I won't, because we'll also get into the conversation around the implications for funders as I ask Yasmine and Ross to reflect on the findings of the report for their organizations and for how they see this work going forward. Something that did occur to me as you were speaking about the systems is your description of different types of ecosystems. So some more formal, more structured, some more informal, less structured. And I wonder if there were some, I mean, you only looked at a few cases, but I wonder if there are some sort of characteristics of these systems. You know, who are the players who provide the evidence or who kind of lead the analysis of the evidence or lead in the action that follows some analysis? Are there any differences in the more structured versus the less structured systems?
Thanks, Kike. I mean, I think one of the key takeaways from the report is that community-led learning ecosystems come in different ways. They are structured in very different manners, and bring together different types of actors. So we did found some that look more traditional in the sense that you would find an academic institution providing the evidence and then engaging with schools, for example. But we also found some that start at the local level and they start as practical solutions and then they kind of went upwards. So I think an interesting thing about community-led learning ecosystems is that they are popping up everywhere, and the diversity is where we can find important lessons. What I think it's very relevant is that I see that every actor can be a knowledge broker. So the teachers involved, the parents, the local NGOs, even the learners themselves have a role to play. And what's really key, the glue that brings all these actors and the structures together is lived experience that is kind of at the center of all this, and the proximity to the community. So I don't know, in some cases, a parent or a local volunteer might notice something critical about how children are learning. And these insights are just as valuable as those from formal research institutions. So I think regardless of the structure, what matters is to have the structures in place that allow for these different sources of knowledge and expertise to come together and then inform thinking, not only towards academic institutions or think tanks and evidence brokers, but the other way around.
Yes, thank you very much. There are two other studies that Marcela has been part of, led. So one is a study we did on scientific advisory systems now a few years ago, which I will share. We'll share in the blurb, and that also identifies different types of systems, from the more structured and formal to the less structured and formal, but also, as you were saying, Marcela, the different histories, different stories of origin and different stories of development, right? And they've all evolved and adapted. And the best ones are the ones that adapt as they evolve. And the other study is one where we looked at knowledge translation in the global south. And again, something that we found, I think echoes what you're saying right now, is that when we ask practitioners about this, they did not identify a distinct role of knowledge translation, but it was something that everybody did one way or the other from their different positions, whether they were researchers or communicators or managers or politicians or just citizens. I think people found it hard to say, okay, this is what knowledge translation is, and it isn't. Well, we all do it. We all part of this process. So I'll share those reports. We'll share those reports with the recording so that it supports this conversation. So thank you very much. Let me turn to our other guests, and I'll start with Yasmine. How do these findings fit with the Jacobs Foundation approach to supporting the generation, communication, and use of evidence?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate to this meeting. So I would say that at the Foundation, we believe that sustainable change in education systems cannot be externally imposed. So we really try to be locally, to have contextually grounded intervention. And I think this is also following a general trend among education practitioners all over the world, the focus on other levels in the education system, on middle tiers. So I think it's a very relevant approach, and that it's promising. And this is what we also try to do at the Foundation. So this systemic change strategy is built around 3 interconnected pillars. The first one, more at a national level, is to strengthen the use of evidence in decision making. The second one, more at the intervention level, is to support evidence-based teaching and learning intervention. And the third pillar, a bit the interconnection between those 2 different levels, is to use pool funding to support locally driven initiative and evidence-based intervention at the district level, for instance, or at any subnational level. So we are really trying to have this kind of systemic approach, and we think that that's the only way to drive systemic change. And so at the core of this third pillar, like the subnational or the locally driven, I would say, level, there is the idea of adaptive learning ecosystems. So those ecosystems are composed, as we have seen, by schools, community, or district officials, for instance. So the community of change approach that we are trying to implement in the country is actually composed of 3 dimensions, I would say. And so this is a 3-stage approach. The first one is to gather people together and to create those multi-stakeholders, coalitions, or change communities, we could say, that could come together and create this learning ecosystem. That's the first step. Then they can discuss evidence, any kind of evidence, as Marcela has pointed out. There is a very broad notion of evidence here, and surface any local insight that could be useful to drive change. And then after that, they can co-create projects that aim to transform local system. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, also to Marcela's point earlier, and a key insight that we have been observing throughout those projects is that evidence needs relationship to drive change. So the community of change approach, and I'm going to describe this maybe later with specific example, but in this approach, evidence is not only provided and then we hope that it's going to be used by by education stakeholders, but it's co-constructed, and then because it has been co-constructed, it's then used by the communities and by the practitioners. So we really believe that if evidence is co-construct, then it is more used. Hence the importance of making space and allow for the creation of those relationships that will in turn make this co-creation happen. So we are trying to focus on that, but we have much to learn yet. I would say that that's a very work in progress, and I'm very happy to discuss that.
Yeah, and we will get to those so sort of remaining questions. Something kind of I sense in your description of the approach is I guess is this sort of concern or caution, right? That an intervention does not overwhelm the existing ecosystem, right? You talked about creating space, giving space, allowing for. And I think that relates to what Marcela was saying, right? So there are existing ecosystems that maybe we haven't identified or documented, but they are there, right? These relationships exist. And there's the challenge that when the funder comes in or when an external actor comes in, it might unsettle those relationships, right? It's working with the grain rather than, forcing them to kind of fit somebody else's approach. But why don't you tell us about some examples maybe that can illustrate this approach?
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I agree with you, Enrique. I think it's very important to think about the political economy of those ecosystems and what funding will do to these systems and how we can change them by providing funding to some actors in this space. And I think it's very important to understand this space and to understand also the influence that we can have. So very, very good comment. Thank you, Enrique. So yes, to give you an example of the implementation of this approach, so the community of change approach in Ghana, and we call it the community of excellence. I would say that Ghana has been kind of the forefront for applying this community of change approach. So with support from the Ministry of Education and Ghana Education Service, we have launched the Community of Excellence program. It has been facilitated by UNICEF in 3 districts and by TITEL in 3 other districts. And one of the models that I'm going to describe, and I want to insist on the fact that there are many different models, and I'm not saying that this one is the best one. I think that's very important to keep in mind that those models can work in different contexts, and it's very important to keep this variety in mind and not be too normative about the approach. I think it's at the essence of this approach to be adaptive. But one model that we have implemented or that we have supported in Ghana is the managing for learning. So it's a participatory methodology, I would say, enabling local stakeholders like head teachers, district officials, students, community leaders, parents, to have a direct say to the priority issues and actions needed to improve learning. And so the result of this coalition is a learning and transformation agenda for each district, for each community of change. And this learning and transformating agenda is then grounded in evidence from evidence and local insights, like very locally driven in terms of evidence. And in each district, there is a diverse group of change leaders composed of the people from this community, teachers, district officials, and they are selected to champion this learning and transformation agenda. And the examples of some results from this approach that I think is very promising is that one key feature of those organizations is the organization of a periodic accountability session from teacher to share learners' progress, with the community and with parents. So actually, they have been gathering evidence from the classroom and shared it with important actors of the community. So it's a creation of evidence, it's a communication of evidence, and then a discussion around it. So that's one example of how this kind of coalitions have led to the creation of very relevant evidence for the community. And also since 2022, we have observed a strengthening of local decision making. So for example, in Ghana, the district education oversight committees, so committees at the district level, previously inactive, now play a very crucial role in education management through regular meetings, school visits, and data-informed decision-making. So it kind of had put some more energy and a new life to an institution that already existed, but that now really serve as a driver for change at the local level. So this approach and other, because we are testing different models in Ghana, will be scaled to 140 districts between 2025 and 2028, which represent around 2,000 communities. And here we can really see, with this scaling up that has been decided by the government, we can really see the virtuous cycle between local initiatives and more national reform. Here we see how national support reinforces what has been proven to work locally. So very interesting case, I think, and very promising.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Yasmine. I think this is a very good example, and it's nice to look at it in one country and realize that there are multiple approaches that can work, but at the same time can also be scaled. Now let me turn to Ross now. Ross, you commissioned the report in the first place, and now I think reflecting on what Marcela has presented and Yasmine's own reflection on those findings, what do you think are the implications for funders interested in these kind of interventions and these?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's really interesting to hear. Well, it's very interesting to read the report, by the way. I'd encourage people to do so. And it's interesting to hear this conversation, which I think does bring out many of the key points. And it also shows that this, as Marcela says, this isn't just a theoretical idea. This is really happening. It's a way of seeing what's happening in many places. So it's a lens through which to look at real innovations in education transformation. So it's, I think, in that regard, not only interesting, but very important. And what I really feel is that now is a time to contribute to cohering the field of learning ecosystems in perhaps three ways, one of which is that we need to see more funding of model learning ecosystems. So this is actually funding the creation of learning ecosystems in a way that we can all learn, which means we also, secondly, then need to fund the generation of evidence about those model learning ecosystems. How are they coming about? We need to tell the stories of how they're coming about, and then, of course, share those stories so that people are learning and adapting what they're learning in the same direction, again, building the field. And the third piece, this really goes to what Marcela said at the beginning. I really think in doing this, we've got to start funding what is often the most difficult thing to fund, which is what I would call the weaving that is required to make this happen. Marcela talked about the need for holding reflective spaces, the spaces in which communities are making sense of the evidence and applying their sense making in practice. So in other words, iterating the creation of their own learning ecosystems. So, all of this work, it requires complex coordination and collaboration and co-creation within local communities, but also between communities and between communities and districts, regional, national, and international level actors. So you need to see this relational work happening in the horizontal at all levels and in the vertical between levels. And this relational work, as I say, what many of us increasingly call weaving, is both essential and complex, but critically, it's often undervalued because it's not recognized. And this, I think, is a critical piece that we need to get behind. We need to fund it in order to see learning ecosystems flourishing.
Thank you, Ross. Can I push slightly and ask you about those complexities? Why is it so hard to fund this weaving?
I think there are a few reasons for that. First of all, I think it's under-recognized as a type of work. So many people that I work with who self-identify as weavers are not paid for that work. They kind of do it on the side. It's often done voluntarily, or it's sort of fudged, so they call themselves something else and they try and make it happen. So I think it's not seen so much, and as a result, it's not particularly valued. And one of the other challenges in valuing it is it's hard to put a kind of tangible outputs on this. It's often seen simply as facilitation, and although it requires facilitation, it's a certain sophisticated type of facilitation that's needed. And so it's often also kind of, in a way, undervalued, even if it's recognized and dismissed. Oh, it's just facilitation. But to your point, Enrique, one of the functions of the weaver in this case is to help circles of people make sense of evidence. And that in itself is not an easy task, because you've got competing perspectives. Often you've got evidence which on the one hand might be scientific and on the other hand might be intuitive. So you've got very quantitative and very qualitative evidence, again, that needs to be navigated. One needs to keep in mind the whole system and not get stuck into projects. So the sophistication of this is quite considerable, but as I say, it's not really understood.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess putting outputs to this role would not necessarily help. It might actually undermine the nature of the role and the value of the role. So we've got to be
exactly
careful.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Yasmine, let me go back to you and ask you about implications of these findings for what is still yet to be learned or understood. You referred to a little bit of the questions remaining that would be great to tackle.
Yes, I think there are many questions. I would say that we are encouraged by the Ghana experience because it has shown that subnational level approaches can drive national reforms, and that they can be very effective and complementary to national reform. So this is something that is not in the blind spot of funders anymore, and that we are really trying to encourage and to support. But there is a lot to learn from that. First, it's important that we understand how to build evidence capacities at those levels without overburdening schools or communities that are already very busy and struggling with a lot of different issues. It's important that we understand what type of evidence are most meaningful and in which context. So it's important that we also open our minds about evidence, and that we move from the very restrictive view of evidence that has been dominating in the field so far. And so many questions remain. This is why we have also wanted to work with OTT to produce this very critical report. And our aim is to document lessons along the way. While we try to implement and to support different models, we would like to be able to identify implementation challenges and to produce knowledge about what is the best approach, or in what context, what is the best approach in what context. And this is not about promoting evidence use. It's about also changing how evidence is understood, who gets to produce it, and how it's used to shape education, not from the top down, but from the community up, really. And so just to give a list of questions and really say that we want to be transparent about those questions, and we really think that there is much to learn, and we are really still exploring this. Of questions that come to mind, and I would love to hear the audience about what they think about that. But we need to, as Ross said, we need to have more evidence on the long-term effect of those approaches, and to compare different models in different contexts. We are also still learning what support communities actually need to use the evidence. Again, I want to emphasize that there is no definitive model, and that it's really important to stay flexible. And this also relates to another difficulty, is that when we try to scale up those kind of approaches, how we can scale those interventions up while still being flexible and adaptive to the context. This is a very important challenge, I think. Also, we know that this work only succeeds if we keep listening, if we keep discuss together, if we keep sharing experiences. So it's really important, I think, that throughout this process, all the education practitioners and stakeholders remain in contact and try to learn from each other's experience. And I agree that it's a complex thing to fund. It's a complex interventions also to measure any impact. So it's not so straightforward, but I think that we should indeed embrace this complexity and keep the conversation going and really try to learn from each other.
Great, thank you. I think there's a lot of these questions sort of suggest that there's a lot to learn about. And I think it echoes what Ross was saying: learn about and talk about, share more about these spaces. Let me pose some of these questions to you, Marcela, as a way of sort of closing the conversation, but also bringing in some questions from the audience that we have here today. And Emily is asking a question that I always sort of also reflected on, which is, Marcela, did you find any efforts to measure or look at caregiver parent perceptions of ecosystems and the evidence that they would find credible or supporting of this shift in what learning looks like for their children?
Yeah. Thanks, Kike. Thanks, Emily. I think that's a great question. And yes, this came up in several conversation of the initiatives we looked at, though not always in formalized ways, I would say. So what we saw is that caregiver and parent perspectives are often central to how community-led learning ecosystems function, but they are rarely captured in conventional monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and that's still a concern. And I think people who are in the field that understand ecosystems and complexity are on top of this, and they understand the question. But on the practitioner side, it's still an emerging question, I would say. In many cases, we saw that parents were actively involved in shaping learning environments. They offered informal feedback, in some cases participated in co-creating programs. It comes to my mind in the comunidades de aprendizaje, so learning communities initiative in Argentina. The parents were brought in to participate in this, it's called tertulias literarias, so basically just like little chats and mixed commissions where parents were playing a direct role in both learning, but also in school governance. But I think their views on what counts as credible evidence doesn't always align with standard education metrics, and that's a problem because parents were often more interested in whether children were happy, engaged, showing confidence. However, the school still has to report on how good are they learning the skills they're supposed to learn. So there is a little bit of a difference in what the different actors value. So yeah, I think in general, the report found early signs of ecosystem trying to surface these insights through storytelling, parent groups, community reflection, but I think this remains underdeveloped. And I think a clear takeaway is that we need better methods and more investment to understand how caregivers perceive learning change.
And just to add to that, Marcela, if I may, that this challenge persists everywhere, doesn't it? That the different valuing of learning outcomes is such a problem where you've got very often very narrow set of learning objectives in the formal school setting, whereas parents, communities, young people themselves know that they need to be developing much more holistic outcomes. And until those things are fully aligned, it's very difficult, I think, to see a coherent learning ecosystem really evolving or emerging.
Great, thanks. And Marcia asked, I think, a very similar kind of questions, a little bit in line with this conversation, and asks about the role of arts-based approaches in generating qualitative evidence within these ecosystems. And I guess how we can better, as she says, how we can better validate these forms of evidence in policy and funding conversations so that they're not seen as second, third, fourth tier, but maybe as legitimate, as useful, as valuable. I don't know if Rose, Yasmine, or Marcela, do you have any reflection on this?
I'm happy to jump in if you like. Okay.
Yeah, Marcela, let's go ahead.
So we heard a lot of examples on creative and arts-based practices. I think one interesting example, if you want to look at, is the work of Fundación Bofill in Barcelona, in Catalonia. I think they have a great approach that brings together the policy side. So you have people working at the policy level change, but also working very closely with the communities to raise awareness and the profile on the importance of arts and leisure as learning opportunities for children. But yeah, in several cases, we looked at storytelling, theater, even participatory photography were used to surface young people's perspectives, which I thought it was very interesting. And I do think they are very powerful tools for generating insight, especially when conventional indicators fall short. But they are still often undervalued in formal evaluation frameworks. And my sense was even the actors working actively on this are still fighting against these perceptions. So yeah, I think in general, to validate them, we need to shift, again, how we talk about rigor. It's not about replacing numbers, but about recognizing that understanding lived experience requires different methods, and funders and policymakers can support this by investing in mixed method approaches, perhaps, I don't know, creating space for community-generated data and value outcomes more like belonging, confidence, and connection. Is usually arts that can help children and young people achieve this. So I think it again goes back to changing the way we understand the education system and the role it has, as Ross said.
This is really interesting. And we've heard throughout this conversation around change, around shifting the way we think, about challenging power structures, challenging assumptions. And there's something that I wanted to ask you, Marcela, from Yasmine's intervention. She spoke to a lot about the need to understand how to deliver this approach at scale while keeping it locally relevant, that tension that often exists. And a reflection is that we often assume that to make a difference, to really make a difference, evidence has to be scaled. But how does this approach or this new lens challenge that?
I think that's a difficult question, and it came up a lot while we were developing the report. And it's a question that was asked by practitioners, but also by people actively working in the evidence use space. But I do think that community-led learning ecosystems challenge that idea to some extent, and they show that local forms of evidence that draw from practice, trust, community insight can drive meaningful change without needing to scale in the conventional sense. And first, I think we need to shift what we value and fund again. So if relational, context-specific evidence can lead to lasting change, then funders and policymakers should prioritize supporting the infrastructure that enables local actors to generate and adapt evidence. So not just the production of evidence for centralized use, which usually leads to scale. And I also think another implication of that would be, overall rethinking scale. Rather than scaling programs, we should be scaling capabilities. I think this is also something that you already mentioned, Yasmine. So the ability of communities to learn, adapt, and collaborate using evidence. So I think this is slower and more complex, but also more sustainable in the long term. So I think it changes the discussion from scaling interventions, and the focus on scaling capabilities and our ability to assess evidence.
Yeah, that's great,
Again,
because the funder might leave, but the community will stay. And they have to have the capacity to sustain this process. Ross, yes?
Sorry, just to also add to that, I think one of the big challenges in this is to find spaces where people really are making sense of the evidence in a way that says what's actually working and what's not working. You know, having the courage to talk about things that are not working, and to having even more courage to stop things that are not working or to change things which are not working. We see a problem throughout. So part of this work that we're talking about in making sense of evidence and applying that sense making into practice, again, comes down to a real willingness of people to have authentic conversations, to admit to failures, and to really commit to change.
And I think maybe to conclude on that we as founders, we have a responsibility toward it, because often it is understood that if something is not working, the funding will just be closed. And I think it's very important that we make sure that we are in the same journey, and that what we want is just to fund effective policies, effective interventions, and that if something is not working, we will just shift to something that is more efficient, and we are happy to learn in the process. So I think we also have a responsibility toward this.
Thank
Yeah, I
you,
fully
Marcela.
agree. And you would imagine that even, you know, if we're committing to doing really new transformative work, we should be expecting to fail, I would say, Yasmine. So we should almost be encouraging failure, to kind of exaggerate your point, Yasmine. I fully agree.
Yeah, as long as we learn from it.
Well,
Exactly.
maybe it's not failure. Maybe it's just it's what happens in life. You know, you stumble along the way, and that's what communities do. Right? Resilient communities don't get everything right, but they pick things up and keep going.
Mhm.
Marcela, Ross, Yasmine, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I think we could keep going for hours, but I like to finish these sessions on a high before people start to log off. But we really look forward to collaborating and answering some of these questions that you have posed for us today, and that I think have been posed by this fantastic report. There is so much more to understand. And I seriously recommend reading the report. Please do share it as well, and do get in touch if you want to keep having a conversation along these issues. You'll find the report's link in the description of this video or podcast. And you can listen to this or other OTT talks by visiting onthinktanks.org, our YouTube channel, or whatever it is that you listen to your podcast. From all of us at OTT and from our guests, goodbye. Thank you.